hit my record button. All right. Good afternoon, World Wide Web. Thank you so much for joining Sharks for Kids for another wonderful webinar. I am Leanne Nguyen, one of the education ambassadors. And before we get into today's talk, I would like to send a special happy birthday shout out to our founder for Sharks for Kids, Mrs. Jillian Morris. Best fishes today and for many more to come. So this afternoon, I have the pleasure of hosting yet another wonderful woman in marine science, Dr. Toby. Dr. Toby actually grew up in the mountains in upstate New York, but has always had a love for sharks. She attended Oberlin College in Ohio and then worked in biotech for 2 years before going on to her master's and PhD at the University of Hawaii, using both lab and field-based tools to study the evolution of shark reproductive strategies. As an assistant professor at the University of West Florida, she ran a shark program tagging and research for 5 years before moving to Florida Institute of Technology. It's in Melbourne, Florida, by the way. And now, as a head of the Shark Conservation Lab at Florida Tech, Dr. Toby and her students conduct integrated lab field research on the molecular ecology and evolution of elasmobranchs. FYI again, that's sharks, skates, and rays, and other fishes, in order to devise innovative ways to manage and protect these fascinating creatures. So without further ado, Dr. Toby is going to talk to us about what DNA can reveal about the secret lives of baby sharks. And just as a reminder, sorry, but the Q&A box is there. Feel free to ask any and all questions. We'll be monitoring them. And then when Dr. Toby is done, we're going to go ahead and present them. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you. I am so excited to be here with you. I am going to share my screen because I have a little bit of a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you guys that is full of some neat pictures and will give you a little bit of an idea about what I do. And first I'm going to try and hide this so that you don't have to see it. All right, so I'm going to talk today about the secret lives of baby sharks. And a major way that I research the secret lives of baby sharks is using DNA. So a lot of the different types of things that I do require a combination of techniques, as you just heard. So part of the time, my students and I get to go outside and tag sharks and be on the ocean, and it's awesome. And then sometimes we're in the lab and we're doing lab work just like you would see at a hospital, looking at DNA and molecules. And there's different techniques that we can use in each of these different settings, and they all help us answer questions about baby sharks. So I want to start by telling you some stuff that you actually might not know about sharks. So a lot of people know, for instance, that they can eat you, right? A lot of people have heard of Jaws. What you might not know, though, is that most sharks don't look like that. Actually, the vast majority of sharks are kind of weird looking. Believe it or not, every animal in this picture is a type of shark or stingray. And stingrays are basically the same animal in a different shape. So while we're all kind of familiar with the dun-dun-dun-dun Jaws kind of shark or the baby shark kind of shark from the song, these are actually sharks also. And a lot of sharks are really, really weird. So something else that you might not know about sharks, which I'm going to talk about today, is that when they reproduce or have babies, they actually have a lot more in common with the way that mammals like humans have babies compared to other fish, because sharks and rays and skates, other elasmobranchs, are a kind of fish, but they're really different from bony fish like you might have in a tank in your house. So they have babies that grow really slowly and they don't have very many at a time. So for instance, most fishes, like goldfishes, are what we call oviparous, which means that they lay eggs. And so they traditionally release these eggs, like thousands of tiny, tiny eggs, into the water in the ocean. And they kind of drift around and they hatch into larvae, and the larvae are teeny and they eventually settle out on the reef. And that is egg laying or oviparity. Sharks, much like humans, are what we call viviparous, meaning live bearing. They don't lay eggs, their babies are born live, just like ours. So, as you can see, here's a human woman on the left, and on the right, you can see a very pregnant female sandbar shark. So that means that sharks have private parts, just like humans. In fact, they have two. So human boys have penises, sharks have claspers, and they have two of them. And female sharks can stay pregnant for anywhere from 7 to 24 months, depending on the species, which, if you're counting, is almost 2 years, which anybody who's ever been pregnant knows that's a really long time. And this means that the way that sharks have babies, it's some of the slowest reproductive strategies on Earth. So some sharks stay pregnant for 24 months, and that's longer than whales, longer than elephants, and a lot of other big animals. So they have very few babies at a time. The pups develop inside the mom, just like people, and they attach to the mom via an umbilical cord, just like you had when you were in your mom's belly. And just like human babies, when that cord is removed, sharks are left with kind of a belly button, except not our belly buttons are down here. Sharks have kind of like little chest buttons from that umbilical cord when they're born. Other sharks grow inside the mama, but instead of connecting to the mama by a cord, they actually have a yolk sac, kind of like a chicken yolk, that goes along with them in their own private little room inside mom. And as the baby grows, and by the way, baby sharks are called shark pups, just like dogs. As the baby shark grows, it uses up, kind of eats that yolk until by the time it's born, it's fully grown and ready to swim off. And you can see here on the left, that's a dogfish shark baby attached to a yolk. On the right, you can see sandbar shark babies attached to an umbilical cord by their little chest button. And on top, what you're seeing there is a kind of shark egg, because some sharks are what we call oviparous or egg laying, but not very many at all. It's actually really unusual for sharks to lay eggs, believe it or not. Most of them have live babies. And believe it or not, they have new and exciting ways of reproducing that we're just finding out. So sharks, you might know, are really ancient kind of animal. They have first evolved over 400 million years ago. So way before the dinosaurs. When sharks evolved, they were the first animal to have closing jaws, hence the name Jaws. And that gave them a huge advantage. They were basically the Earth's first predator. But believe it or not, even though they've been around longer than just about any other animal, we're still discovering lots of new things about them. So for instance, this is a new discovery. It was just made this past year, where scientists discovered a type of shark that lays eggs, but instead of having a regular egg case like other sharks do, I'll go back for a minute. Lots of other sharks, their egg cases kind of look like this. They're made of a type of fingernail material that lets air in and water pass through and oxygen, so that the babies live. And then when they're ready to be born, they just break out of their little egg cases. These have egg cases that are completely transparent. And scientists still don't really know why this strategy exists. But because sharks have been on Earth for so long, they've had a lot of time to specialize and diversify and evolve to fit a lot of different environments on Earth. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about what I do. There's not a whole lot that we know about any sharks, let alone baby sharks. And so what I do, as I said, is I use genetics in the lab and then other techniques both in the lab and outside the lab to ask questions about shark behavior, meaning what they do, how they act, why they act that way, and how that helps them make a living. And I also am interested in shark movement. Where do they go? Why do they go that way? What do they do when they get there? And do they ever come back? And so I take these tools and I use them to study the distribution, meaning where are the sharks in the world? Where are they located and where are they moving around in? And then also diversity. How many different kinds of sharks are there? A lot of them look a lot alike, but are they different in their DNA, even though they look so similar? Because turns out that diversity, meaning lots of different kinds, especially when you're talking about DNA, lots of different kinds of DNA types. Having that diversity, which we call genetic diversity, can actually help protect populations of animals from extinction. So we know that the more diversity a species has, the less likely it is to go extinct. And that's something else that we can tell from looking at its DNA. So I look at the distribution, where the sharks are, where they're moving, and what kinds of sharks they are in their DNA. And I use that to try and make findings that can help shark conservation. Now, I wish we were all sitting in a room together, because then I could ask you guys directly, do you know what conservation is? I bet some of you do. Well, let me tell you, conservation, when you're studying animals, means figuring out how to protect animal populations from going extinct. And you may have heard that there are groups of animals in our world that people are kind of worried about being at risk for extinction. So things like polar bears, you may hear about a lot with how climate change is affecting animals and how these animal populations are surviving and how healthy they are in their natural habitat now that we know the environment is changing. And so conservation is taking the best information that we have and figuring out strategies to protect and conserve populations of animals like sharks so that they're around for a lot of years. So that's what I do. Let's get to the cool stuff. What can we find? Well, it turns out that a lot of sharks, again, just like people, many, many, many baby sharks are born into what we call nurseries. So just like if when you were born, your folks had a place in your house where they put you and all of your stuff, all of your diapers and all of your toys and all of your medicines and all of your bedding and all of everything that was just for you, baby you. Turns out baby sharks have the same exact thing. They have what we call nursery habitat. And what that means is that when they're born, they are either born into or they can move right into this very special nursery area that's tailor-made for baby sharks. And it's shallow and often warm. Shallow so that big sharks can't come in and maybe eat the babies. And because it's full of tiny little fish and crabs and shrimps and other things that baby sharks really like to eat. This map, by the way, is looking at the southern coast of Texas. So if you're in Texas, looking at you guys, this is the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And all of these little yellow and blue spots that you see on the map are where baby sharks have been caught. So you can see they're not out in the middle of the ocean where it's really deep. They're actually really shallow. They're in bays, sometimes rivers, places where it's kind of sheltered and shallow, and there's lots of good food for baby sharks. And you may be asking yourself, like I did, okay, baby sharks they use nurseries, but how do they get there? Turns out that moms, and we've known this for a little while, female sharks, mama sharks, use what's called phylopatry or natal homing. And what that means is they return year after year to give birth in the same place where they themselves were born or where they gave birth the last time. So kind of like salmon. Like, have you heard how salmon will return to the river where they're born to give birth or to have their babies? It's true. And we've known for a while that female sharks do this. They like to pick out just a few nursery habitats in one part of the world, and then they go back to that same area over and over and over. And we see this all over the world in places like Kaneohe Bay in Hawaii, and Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, and habitats in the Gulf Coast of Texas, like you just saw, all over the world where there's shallow areas, there's going to be baby sharks. And so what the moms do is, it turns out they will actually migrate thousands of miles back to the nursery habitat that's their favorite and give birth in that spot. And so we found this is something that scientists have known for a while, because scientists have been putting tags on sharks, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment, to watch where they go. So we kind of knew this about female sharks, but by using genetics, we were able to find out that not only are female sharks moving back to their favorite nurseries in ways that we can see with our eyes, when we use genetics, we can find out that they've been using the same nursery habitats for thousands and thousands of years. So not only do females use phylopatry, but they're creatures of habit. They've been going back to the same places over and over and over because it works. So how do we figure all of this out? Well, it helps to know whether or not a shark is a male or a female, or if it's a baby, or if it's an adult, and maybe where it was born. And all of those pieces of information we call demographics. So we collect those data when we first take a DNA sample from a shark, and we do it, or we try our best, and the vast majority of time we're successful, is we can take a tiny bit of DNA from the shark without hurting it, and we release it, and it swims away fine with a tag that we can monitor and see where that shark is going. And so at the same time, when we take a little tiny piece of fin for our DNA analysis, we also take measurements. We record the species, we record the sex of the shark by looking under its drawers, and we can figure out, based on what species it is and how big it is, whether or not it's a baby or an adult. So we just need to take a moment to look at these adorable baby shark pictures. Like, oh my God, come on. This one on the top left, that's a baby whale shark. Cutest, right? That thing will grow to be the size of several buses. This picture that's a baby mako shark. You can see a person's hand on its nose, just measuring that guy. And then the bottom left, that's a baby nurse shark, I believe, baby nurse shark. And on the bottom right, that's a baby tiger shark. Kind of looks almost like a giraffe kind of markings when it's a baby. And as that animal grows, it'll grow so big and that its skin stretches and creates those famous stripes that tiger sharks are famous for. So these are the kinds of data that we take on baby sharks, and that tells us how they might behave. Here's where the genetics comes in. What do we do with DNA? Well, it's a technique called seascape genetics. And what that means is taking DNA from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individual sharks and mapping them literally across a seascape, meaning information that we get from the environment, from satellites and ocean buoys. So we take things like sea surface temperature, dissolved oxygen, currents, wind, all sorts of different environmental data over the same map that we have our genetic diversity of all of these different sharks mapped out. And when we do that, we can actually do statistics that give us an idea of what kinds of things in the environment are affecting sharks and how they move and where they go. So this is a fancy way of saying we're basically just using DNA fingerprinting on sharks to look at their DNA, and we're putting it in the context of their ecology and their environment. This, by the way, is my student Eloise, who is awesome. So when we tag sharks, we can get data that we call telemetry. Telemetry is using satellite and radio tags to show us literally where the sharks are going. So you can see here, these are data from OSearch on 2 tiger sharks. Actually, that might be a white shark. That's a white shark. Tiger shark and a white shark, Steph, and this guy, Lando. Oh no, he is a tiger shark. And they have satellite tags. So you can literally download data from space that shows us where these sharks are moving. And so tagging sharks is important to look at physically where they're going. But the problem is, it doesn't shed any light on what these sharks are doing when they get there. So we can see where they go, but we don't have a camera on them that's saying, okay, we're going to eat some fish now, or this is a really good place to give birth. So that's where the genetics really come in handy. What we do with genetics is we look at not just where animals have been, but where they've left their DNA. So where are they reproducing? This is some work by my student Maggie, who's also awesome. She took DNA from over 350 tiger sharks. All of them had been tagged. So we had demographic data. We knew if they were babies or their moms or dads, adults, whatever. And then she did DNA fingerprinting. So she got a profile of each individual shark's genetic diversity. And so we were able to ask questions about that individual shark and how it's related to all the other sharks that we caught, and also shark populations as a whole. So together, telemetry and genetics can tell us not just where the sharks are going, but what they're doing. Are they mating with other sharks and leaving babies? Because again, this is all about finding out where are the babies and what are they doing. So we take all those data and we build shark family trees. So this is Maggie giving a poster. She's awesome. And this is her work. One of the things she found within that group of 360 tiger sharks, there were 32 of them that were related to each other, meaning they were either parent and baby or brother, sister, or sister, siblings, or parent, offspring. So this map and these arrows go from one end to the other, show 2 individuals that were caught in all of these different places that had a relative in another place. So those arrows are connecting 2 relatives. So we found that, sharks are apparently not necessarily staying where they're first born. They're born, baby sharks are born, and then they move. They may go back to where they were born, but in the meantime, they're moving really long distances, which we kind of knew from tracking, but this shows us that not only are they moving thousands of miles, for instance, migrating to follow food, but they're actually migrating between nursery sites. So here's a little bit of genetics from Maggie's work. We use the DNA to do what's called assignment testing, meaning we took all of our sharks and we looked at their genetic diversity and we asked how many different types of tiger sharks are there in this group, meaning how many different populations. A population is a group of animals that's just a subgroup of the species as a whole. So we're not looking at tiger sharks all over the world. We're looking at the tiger sharks just in the Atlantic near Florida. But we want to know, according to their DNA, is there more than one kind mixing? I mean, they all kind of look the same. They're all tiger sharks. But underneath the skin, are they secretly different from each other? And so what Maggie did was just this. When she surveyed all of the sharks together, she got this one graph that just kind of looks the same across all of these different sites down here, places on the Gulf of Mexico and the Bahamas and South Carolina and Alabama. You can see they all kind of look the same. It's just blue with a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow. Well, turns out we got this result because of how much sharks move after they're born. When my student decided to look just at the baby sharks, so she took out all the grown-up sharks, she found something totally different. What this shows you down below is a nice clean graph that shows differences. So 3 populations, 1 blue, 1 yellow, 1 red, like you can see. Each of those bars signifies a different color or a different population. So turns out not only are there different kinds of tiger sharks in the Atlantic that we can only tell with their DNA, it's really the babies where we're seeing this difference. And so Maggie put this all in a map, and this is what it looks like. Remember, we've got those 3 colors. That means different genetic populations or groups. And then we've got a little bit of areas where they're mixing. But what this shows you is that even though, even though these areas are very close to each other, you know, there's no wall in between Florida and Alabama, there's different genetic types of sharks found in each place. It's not just one big population that's mixing all over the place, but they look exactly the same. So why is this happening? Well, it turns out that genetics told us from looking at these differences just between the babies that it's not just mom who's coming back to the same nursery areas over and over. It's dad also. So if mom and dad were mixing it up and reproducing in all sorts of different areas, we would get what we call gene flow, basically DNA moving around between populations so that it looks like one big population. But even though adult sharks, tiger sharks, can literally move hundreds and hundreds of miles in a couple weeks, they are both mom and dad are coming back to the same little spot over and over and over and over. And in fact, that spot is probably where they themselves were born. So this tells us that physical movement, like you saw on those tags, doesn't equal reproductive movement. Even though those sharks are moving, wherever they're going, they're not always mating. And also, if I go back up to this little map for a second, you see this thing right here? See how all of these colors are represented and it's really colorful? That's an area of Florida called the Big Bend. And it turns out that it is an enormous nursery habitat, nursery area for all kinds of baby sharks. And it is the most diverse area in the entire range, meaning that sharks, mom and dad sharks from other parts of the Atlantic Ocean, probably further south, are actually coming in to the Gulf of Mexico by Florida and giving birth and dropping their pups off and then leaving because it's such a great place to grow up if you're a baby shark. Really lots of nice shallow habitat, you know, and lots of buddies, lots of people to play with. So that nursery area is the most diverse, the place in the map where you see the most different kinds of baby sharks and the most diversity. And remember how I said diversity is really important for keeping populations healthy and helping them to avoid going extinct. So this tells us that nurseries for sharks are really important. They have a lot of genetic diversity, and so that is important habitat that we should be careful to make sure that we conserve and protect. All right, second discovery, turns out baby sharks are leaving home early. So this is your average big mama tiger shark. With sharks, like with most fish, the females, the moms, are actually bigger than the boys. So when we're talking about the really big sharks, it's always the females. The max size that a female tiger shark can get is about 15 feet. But it turns out that even though they can get enormous, and let me give you a little bit of context. You kind of can't tell because I'm sitting down, but I'm about 5 feet tall. So mama tiger shark here is worth about 3 of me when I'm scuba diving. So it's a pretty big animal. And you would think, since they grow to be that big, that they don't really leave where they're born until they're relatively, grown up, just like us. We tend to live with our families and our houses until we're grown up and we can take care of ourselves. But believe it or not, baby tiger sharks leave home when they are less than half the size of the adult. So for us, that would be like leaving home when we're basically like, I don't know, 9 years old, which seems kind of long, but it's amazing. Who knew that by the time these little sharks are barely half grown, they're already getting ready to leave home and migrate hundreds and even thousands of miles. All right, so we've talked a little bit about things that you might not know about sharks, like the fact that they have babies kind of like mammals, like humans, or the fact that they are really diverse. Well, let me tell you about some stuff. We're going to move on now to things we're just finding out about sharks. This is like late breaking news. It turns out that not only do sharks reproduce really slowly, which can make it hard for them to come back after they've been overfished or after they've had an extinction event, can make it difficult to come back because they just don't grow up very quickly. We knew that they grew slowly, but we didn't know that it turns out that sharks can live not just as long as humans, but way longer. This is research on the Greenland shark, the first shark that was studied in this way, using a special technique that actually studies the fluid inside the like gummy jello stuff inside the shark's eyeball. I kid you not. This is like brand new research that shows that these sharks that were caught were anywhere between 250 and 450 years old. And there's no way that those scientists caught the oldest shark in the ocean. So sharks live way longer than we thought they did. Unfortunately, they're also way more fragile than we realize. Maybe because sharks are so good at making a living. They're so good at being predators that are perfectly adapted to their environment, a perfect fit for their environment because they've had so long to evolve. But it might be a trade-off. Maybe they're so well suited to their environment. That means if we mess with their environment at all, like do things like catch them on a hook or take them out of the water to take a picture before we put them back, it causes them to literally stress out to death. So you might have heard that stress is bad for you. Well, it turns out if you're a shark, it's true. Stress can literally kill you. And so when a shark is on a line, when it's being angled, that contributes to the animal's stress. And even if you release it live, it may actually die later. And some shark species are way more fragile than other ones. Like tiger sharks, they are pretty robust. But things like hammerheads with the weird looking heads, they are so fragile, boy, you just like look at them funny or think about them wrong and they die. Another thing we're finding out now is that not only are there new strategies like the transparent egg case, there's actually a lot of new shark species that we're still discovering. So even though we know that there's up to 1,000 shark and ray and skate species out there, they're still finding new ones. And part of the problem is that sharks are sometimes, in a lot of places, at risk of extinction. And so depending on what part of the world you're in, there may be sharks that are going extinct before they're even being discovered and described by science. And part of this is because a lot of sharks really look the same, except they're very different when you look at their DNA, just like the tiger sharks. And so not only are there new species, but a lot of them are deep, deep ocean species. And so what we're doing is we're using genetics to examine these species of shark that all kind of look the same. And what we're finding out is in actuality, they're really different under the skin. They're just all really well adapted to making a living in their environment. And so they end up looking similar to each other, whereas really they're totally different species in the deep ocean and also in the shallow ocean. So this is kind of the main point. The coolest thing that I think is coming out of this is that we're finding out that because of the baby sharks and the fact that they need this special nursery habitat, and they need to kind of be delivered there by their parents, it turns out that even these massive shark species like great whites and tiger sharks, which can swim thousands of miles, they are what we call habitat dependent, meaning even though they're all over the world, they have to come back to this special little spot every time they want to have babies. So even though their whole environment might encompass the whole ocean, it's these little nurseries that are critical for their survival. And so in reality, they're not using their whole range. They're not using the whole world. They're using these specific little spots. And that means that where you do see sharks, it's often because they're mating or because they're giving birth or because they're feeding. And so in fact, I want to show you this fun little video. This is a video clip of a baby white shark being really curious. What you're going to see in a moment is an underwater shot of a BRUV, baited remote underwater video station, which basically means a cage full of dead fish mounted with a piece of rebar that we've attached a GoPro to. And we put this thing down in Vizcaíno Bay in Mexico because we heard that there were baby white sharks there. And sure enough, we actually saw one. But remember, sharks are really fragile and they're really long-lived. So it turns out that they're not just mindless predators. They're actually really careful, as you can tell with this baby white shark. So what I'm going to play it a couple times. So check it out. So it's not great visibility, but you can see there's the baby shark kind of looking at the fish. Maybe smells good, but not that interested. But wait, what's it gonna, oh,
he ran into the GoPro.
It bit the camera because they're just so cute. I'll show you one more time. Here's the baby. Oh, smells interesting. Meh, too easy. I'm gonna bite the camera. What's this? Nom,
he ran into the GoPro.
So it's kind of amazing that just because you hear that there are baby sharks in a place, that you can actually sync a camera and get a picture of these animals. That's how much they're using these nursery areas. All right, before I let you go, I just wanted to say one quick thing. Since it's Women in Science, And that's what we're featuring. I was super lucky. I got to go to Mexico and take DNA samples from great white sharks, both the babies that you saw just a minute ago, and I know when I say baby, it's still like 6 feet long, but it's a baby. And I got to go cage diving with the adults, and I used a biopsy tipped spear to get tiny little skin samples that we used for DNA and genetic analysis. But believe it or not, so this is me in that picture. I know, hard to tell. But before, only about a few months before, I took this picture. So this is me and my pups, my baby sharks. So I'm showing you this just because you may not have seen a female shark biologist, including a female shark biologist who's also a mama. But turns out there's a lot of us out there. So if you're interested in studying sharks, if you're a boy, if you're a girl, doesn't matter. You can do it. So I just wanted to say thank you to my lab and my students and everybody who's helped me. If you want to find us on social media, here's where we are. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was super awesome. And again, great videos and amazing ending message for everyone. Such an inspiration. We do have some questions for some quite little ones, which is awesome. So I just want to jump right into it while you're doing that. We have Audrina, who is 8 years old and wondered, do any sharks actually eat their babies?
Not on purpose. There are really interesting behaviors. I'm just trying to find out where I stopped sharing my screen. I'll figure that out in a moment. But it's interesting, when mom sharks give birth, what we have found is that they just don't really eat. Like, they shut off the feeding mechanism for days or weeks, probably so that they don't eat the babies, like you were saying, because, you know, that just wouldn't be great. Oops, I don't want to do that. So thank you. So yeah, the one thing we know that sharks do in order to avoid eating their babies is to give birth and drop those babies off in a special nursery area that's like too shallow for most big sharks to come in and eat them. But also there are these cool behaviors, like the mom literally doesn't eat. And we know that because we've tried to catch them using a fish on a hook so that we could put tags into some mama sharks. And it's really, really hard because they don't eat. They won't bite on a hook.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Quite interesting and always fascinating the more you learn. So we have another one talking, I know you talked about age and size, but just as a review, Kai, who is, Kai actually asked, how small do they get? So how small are baby sharks?
Well, it depends on the species. Thank you, Kai. Good question. The littlest sharks, even when they're all grown up, the tiniest species of sharks that we know of are only about this big, like 6 inches. And so when they're born, you can imagine the babies are like, meow. And some, I mean, like the whale shark is the biggest fish on earth. And the babies are only like, you know, yay big. And so when mom is pregnant, she can have like 100 or 200 babies. But other sharks, like the great white, instead of having a lot of babies that are small, they actually only have a few. So a mama great white will only have, you know, maybe 3 or 4 babies, but they're really big when they're born. So it really just depends, but they're all pretty cute.
Thank you. So in opposite sense, Savannah was wondering how big. So what's the largest whale shark that you're aware of?
I believe whale sharks can get up to about 60 feet, which is really amazing. And the biggest fish on Earth that we know of. I mean, we think of dinosaurs as big, but really the blue whale is the largest animal that has ever existed that we know of. So there's a lot of big animals now, and the whale shark is the biggest shark by far. And it gets huge, but fortunately, it doesn't eat other fish or other big animals. It eats tiny, tiny, tiny little animals like shrimp.
Awesome. So Alexander, actually at 9 years old from Florida, is wondering about age. So you had talked about it, but can you just tell us again how old?
You know, this is something that we're just finding out now. And it used to be that the way scientists could tell how old a shark was actually by looking at the bones in its back, believe it or not. So your spine bones that you have running up your back, sharks have something very, very similar in their spine. But what's crazy is that as they grow up, sharks lay down like rings in their spines, kind of like the rings in a tree. So, you know, as a tree grows, it puts on layers of bark the bigger it gets. Every year it puts on a new layer. And so if you cut that tree open, you can count the rings and see how old it was. And you can do something very similar with sharks. And believe it or not, scientists did that. I mean, for years and years and years, we thought each ring in the shark's bone was a year. And so that's how we counted how old they were. But it turns out, we're just finding out now that sharks, after they reach a certain age, usually when they reach maturity, those little rings, they stop being every year. It turns out that it might actually be every 2 years, every 3 years, every 10 years. We don't know. It depends on the species. So this is really recent research, but it turns out that a lot of the techniques that we've been using to figure out how long sharks live are wrong. And sharks are living a lot longer than we thought. And that's why the scientists who study the Greenland sharks developed this cool new technique to look at the jelly in its eye. And I have no idea how they did it. It's just awesome.
Amazing. So now for some of us, we just had lunch or we're getting close to. So Xavier, actually, as well as Yosley, were wondering, what do sharks eat?
Whatever they want. No, I'm just kidding. Well, it depends on the shark. So like I said, there's a lot of different kinds. And you might have heard sharks referred to as an apex predator, which means that they're at the top of the food chain. They're the biggest and the baddest. But in reality, most sharks are not that big. Most sharks are kind of medium sized and even quite small. And so they're not apex predators. They're what we call meso predators. They're in the middle of the food web. And so most sharks eat other kinds of fish. Even tiger sharks and white sharks, which are famous for eating seals and turtles, most of the time they're eating fish because that's what's around. So it really depends on the size of the shark, what size prey it can eat. But what's interesting is that most sharks, like I said, they're not at the top of the food chain. They're actually in the middle, which means not only do they eat fish, but they themselves are important food for other sharks. So a lot of sharks, one of their favorite things to eat is other kinds of sharks.
Well, thank you. Now, you were talking again about being a mom and things like that. So we actually had someone ask, how old were you when you got into this work, actually?
Well, I have, like you were saying, I grew up nowhere near the ocean, but I loved sharks. And so I always knew I wanted to try and study sharks, even before I knew what that meant. I knew I wanted to know about them. And, but, you know, I didn't live near the ocean. And so I just did, you know, kind of my best with where I was. So I worked my butt off and school, and it's hard because I was not the best student, especially with math and even science. And for a while, I was really worried that maybe I just wasn't good at it and maybe I wasn't going to get to be a scientist. But then it turns out that when you work really hard, you get past all the boring stuff, and at some point, they let you really do the cool stuff. And I am not that great in school, but it turns out I'm stubborn and I can work really hard. Even when there's no teacher telling me what to do, if I'm really interested in something like, where are these baby sharks? What are they doing? Why are they there? I like to get to the bottom of that mystery. And so once I got through taking classes and got into doing research, I found that it wasn't just all math and physics in school. It was it's having to be creative and being curious and being excited and willing to work hard, even when you're frustrated, and to kind of bang your head against the wall a few times until something works, and be willing to bang your head against the wall a few more times just in case. So turns out it's not the smartest person who gets to be a scientist, because I am not the smartest person. It's people who are willing to work their butts off and who are curious and stoked.
Thank you. That question was from Guadalupe. Now, Blake wants to know, what is your favorite shark and why?
Ooh, good question. I have a few. I like tiger sharks a lot because they are just so pretty. And when they're babies, like that baby tiger shark that you saw, I took that picture from when I was in school, and they're just so pretty. I mean, they look like the little giraffes, and they're all skinny, and they're just really cute. And then when they grow up, they're just like a tank, man. They have these big blunt heads, and they're just, at a certain point, they seem to stop getting longer, and they just get bigger and fat, and they're amazing. But I also really like the deep water sharks, like the weird six-gill sharks, which is a crazy dinosaur, like really old ancestral kind of deep water shark that people don't know a lot about. So I really, even though I get into studying things that you've heard of, like the tiger shark, the white shark, the bull shark, my favorite types of sharks are those weird sort of deep water squishy ones that nobody knows anything about.
Ah, thank you. Well, thinking about, the weird and deep water ones, Callie actually had a question. What do baby sharks do at night? Do you know?
Good question. Well, a lot of times I've heard that there's a myth out there that sharks don't see really well. So that's why you don't go like swimming at night, because sharks can't see you because they have bad eyesight. Well, it turns out actually sharks can see really well. And because they've evolved a long time ago, they've had a long time to adapt to their environment. So depending on whether or not they're a shallow water shark or a deep water shark, they have specialized ways of seeing. So shallow water sharks, they get light from the sun kind of filtering down, and so their eyes are not that different from ours. But the deep water sharks have specialized vision. They have really big eyes, and their eyes have mirrors in the back, just like you see with like nocturnal mammals. So have you ever shined a flashlight in the woods and seen eyes shining back at you from a raccoon or a cat? Turns out sharks have the same thing. And that lets the sharks be active at night and keep hunting or migrating or moving around or doing whatever it is that they're doing, even though it's dark, because they can make the most out of whatever little tiny bits of light filter down into the deep ocean. And some sharks are even specialized predators who hunt more at night rather than during the day, because they don't like too much light. But it also helps that sharks have 5 other amazing senses in addition to vision that they can use even if the light isn't good enough to see.
Ah, well, thank you. Speaking of nighttime, we have a few people, Kara, Isaiah, a few others were wondering, do sharks sleep?
Good question. The short answer is we're not sure. So all of you who are out there who are asking yourself this question, it's a really good question, and we need future scientists like you to start answering some of these questions when you decide if you want to be a professional scientist. Yeah, the short answer is We simply don't really know. That's one of those big black boxes that we're just not really sure. There's a lot, turns out, that we don't really know about sharks, more in reality than I think we do know. We're starting to learn things like sharks can sense magnetic waves and they use it to migrate like birds. I mean, there's just all sorts of questions out there that we need you guys to answer.
Indeed. There's so many questions.
Sorry, I didn't really know the answer to that one, but it's a good
No. Yes, definitely. A lot of people are asking about orcas and dolphins, and are they related? Because sometimes they look like sharks. Can you give us?
They do look like sharks, but it turns out that whales, and including killer whales and dolphins, are actually mammals, meaning they feed their babies with milk, and they're more closely related to us than they are to fish, like sharks. But the reason they look the same, meaning they have very sort of nice streamlined bodies that make them glide through the water, and they have fins or flippers that help them move, that's a result of evolution, because both whales and sharks, even though one is a mammal and one is a fish, they all evolved in the same environment, in that water. And so over time, they became adapted, meaning they grew to be a better and better fit to their environment. They got better at making a living in the water. And it turns out having paddles instead of like fingers is the best way to do it. And so that's why these animals look the same, not because they're related to each other, but because they've evolved in the same environment. So they have the same kinds of adaptations.
Thank you for that. They are adaptations, evolution, mind-blowing and amazing. So we have time for one last question, and I want to take this one because I think it would really, reach and inspire everybody. Amanda was wondering, are you ever afraid of getting bitten when you're studying the sharks, or are you nervous about swimming in the ocean?
Yeah, definitely. Maybe because I know what's down there, when I'm at the beach, I like to be able to see under the water. I like to have a snorkel mask partly because I'm curious, and partly because, yeah, sure, I always think about sharks. And, lots of people are scared of sharks, and it's the most normal thing in the world. I mean, they could actually hurt you, but there's so little chance because there's so few sharks out there that I try and tell myself that really what I'm scared of is fear of not knowing, just fear of the unknown. There could be anything down there. There's probably not. And so, yeah, I like to have a mask on so that I can see, because yeah, it's totally human and normal to think about, oh gosh, there might be sharks here. But in reality, there's no way you're going to get bitten by a shark. And even if you were, which is like getting struck by lightning 3 times, which is rare, even if you did, over 99% of shark attacks are not fatal. Here in Florida, when we have a lot of blacktip sharks near the beach, sometimes there's what people call a shark attack. And what it is that these blacktip sharks, which are small, are in the same environments looking for food as people happen to be swimming. And so every once in a while, one of the sharks like bumps into somebody's leg and scrapes it. And that counts as an attack. So just try and tell yourself that, believe it or not, they're more afraid of you than you are of them, and that it's totally normal to be scared. But don't let it keep you from exploring the ocean, because it's amazing.
Thank you so much. And that's such a great way to end. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for you sharing your story, your inspiration, sharing these pictures and videos with everyone. Thank you everyone for, tuning in and these great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to every single one, but definitely check us out on the website. Again, sharksforkids.com. We have another webinar coming up for those of you who are artistic, how to draw a goblin shark in light of Halloween. And definitely Go on to our website. We have lots of education information, all the recorded webinars from the previous and then upcoming schedule for those to come, as well as we're on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Check us out. And thank you again, Dr. Toby. Continue the work, continue being inspired, students, children of all ages, and best wishes to everyone out there. And again, happy birthday, Jillian Morris. Bye. Thank you.